Hello, my good human. Welcome back to my channel. And if you're new here, thank you for joining us. I'm Luana from luanarose.com, nervous system specialist. And here on my channel, I talk and teach about all things nervous system health, relational health in this video, and trauma healing. In today's video, I'm answering the question, what is your attachment style? This question is in two videos, two parts. I've broken it down just because it was getting too long. So in the first video here, we're talking about avoidant dismissive attachment and anxious ambivalent attachment. In the second video, part 2, which is also here on my channel, I'm talking about disorganized and secure attachment. I've made a whole playlist on attachment. It's called Attachment Education over on my channel. So after this video, be sure that you stick around and check out the other videos as well. Attachment theory was created by Dr. John Bowlby back in the 1950s and later on continued by his Canadian assistant, Mary Ainsworth, and basically states that those relationships with our mom and dad set the foundation for the rest of our relationships that we'll have in life. And it basically shows us how we will see the world, the possibilities that we perceive, the amount of embodied safety that we feel, our ability to have optimism, our ability to genuinely connect with others, trust others, and take calculated risks in life. Attachment is really thought of as our foundation for our relationships for the rest of our life. So in those formative years, particularly from birth to 3 years old, we adapt. We adapt to our environment, and therefore this adaptation to our environment, including those primary caregivers, will determine our baseline of that attachment development, whether it's secure, insecure, or possibly a mixture of both. And it's really important to note with these insecure attachment tendencies or styles is that neurologically we can change. This is what neuroplasticity is, our ability for our brain and body to change itself with the right conditions and support. So as we go through, for example, in this video, avoidant and anxious and ambivalent, you'll start to see on the outside how that shows up in behaviors and relating to others. And at the very baseline, at the level of the autonomic nervous system and our stress physiology, how we process stress internally, right? The same thing is happening. It's stressful to have an insecure attachment style. Our system is being taxed. It's being, we're working harder than we need to be. Our cortisol, adrenaline will be up in avoidant and anxious. Our heart rate will change in both. So even though on the outside these attachment styles look very different, on the inside, physiologically, the same stress response and survival strategy is happening. This is why I like to call these attachment tendencies and styles. It's our survival strategies that we've learned since day one. So take some empathy on this journey understanding the attachment styles. And let's get right into avoidant dismissive. Avoidant dismissive can look like being dismissive, of course, aloof, disconnected, self-sufficient, overly self-sufficient, insensitive. These folks can present as off in their own world or dissociated, detached, cold, standoffish, a lone wolf, or a workaholic. We'll see in avoidant dismissive, the left brain can be actually what some people say is overdeveloped. So our left brain is our logical, analytical, problem-solving brain. So because of the focus on what I'll share about how avoidant dismissive develops, we'll see in adulthood that there's this emphasis on analyzing logical things, and these folks can kind of get lost when it comes to emotional expression, or they're the people that are just like, I'm not creative at all, I don't believe in intuition, these kinds of things. In adulthood, how does this manifest? So many times a common thread here is, let's say I have an avoidant dismissive attachment style. It's easier for me to connect and make friends with and bond with animals or inanimate objects, because there's not this fear of rejection or fear of being abandoned. A puppy will always love you and show up no matter what, especially if you're stocked with treats and toys and playtime. So for a person that resonates with dismissive avoidant, that relational field wasn't safe. It wasn't safe to be in connection with others because there was this looming threat of rejection or abandonment. So folks that resonate with this attachment style can really lean into bonds with animals, bonds with inanimate objects like cars or plants or something that they can be interested in, and it's not a human, so there's less stakes in the connection and interaction with that animal or inanimate object. And at an extreme, these folks can call themselves robots, really, at an extreme. In my dating history, I dated this guy once, and he would always refer to us as, that saying, like, where's your better half, or the other half. And he would say that I'm the human half and he's the robot half. So guess what attachment style he resonated with? It's this one. It's avoidant dismissive, because at an extreme, the avoidant dismissive really feels like an alien, a lone wolf, and can feel like a robot inside, waking up, going through the motions of life, but not really having any intimate connections, platonic or romantic, of any sort. If I'm avoidant dismissive, my original relational blueprint wasn't nourishing. When I reached out, there was no one there. So this person will show up as not reaching out. They won't be the first one to make that phone call or the first one to make a move in making business connections or new friendships, whatever it is, because the risk is too great. The risk of rejection and that pain and that suffering that is implicit in our body, those subconscious memories that aren't always logical, are very much there if I'm avoidant, dismissive, resonating person. At the root of this, my fear of rejection, my fear of being dismissed, is holding me back from creating true connection and forming deep, long-lasting bonds. And this can go back as far as in utero or at birth. For example, someone that I worked with was in the first 3 months of life, they had to spend those 3 months of life in an incubator in the hospital. So they were deprived of touch, connection, and they were isolated at a time when a baby needs human connection and co-regulation the most. So growing up, this person that I was working with, 36, somewhere around there, and working as an entrepreneur, working alone at home, didn't have a lot of deep connections, but had a lot of people in his friend circle, and working through that early basically touch deprivation and connection deprivation really enabled him to make milestones in his ability to feel safety in connection and kind of lessen that fear of rejection and abandonment. So that is an implicit memory that someone can store in their cells due to, for this person's example, he had medical procedures that needed to be done to keep him alive. So implicit memory is unconscious, that subconscious memory that lives within our somatic experience or somatic body, and we don't know that it's holding us back until we know, right? So 3 months old versus 36 years old and highly successful in many areas, like financially and all that stuff, but there's an undercurrent of suffering in silence, which is kind of the dismissive avoidant, what we can resonate with. Let's go ahead and move on to the contributors, the contributing factors to the dismissive avoidant. How does a dismissive avoidant person get to be the way they are? So first off, isolation, as I just shared in my example. So it can be something like medical trauma that, is keeping the baby or the little one's best interest in mind, alive, right? And sometimes we are isolated from family when that has to happen. Other times it can be isolation in the sense of a kid is left alone too much. A lot of folks that I work with, unfortunately, they were isolated to the extreme of, neglect, being 5 years old, having to wake up, make their breakfast, make their porridge, and take themselves out the door to the school bus. That is isolation and neglect. So depending on where we are on the spectrum or what we might resonate with, isolation is a key factor in developing a avoidant, dismissive attachment style because there's simply no one there. Another part of that spectrum, part of that continuum, is we can be present as parents, but emotionally disconnected, emotionally unavailable. So that is another form of isolation. I can be around the kids, but be totally checked out and disassociated myself because I'm overwhelmed with work, with unhealed traumas in my body, whatever it may be. So that's physical presence, emotional unavailability, which is probably the most common one in our society today. So moving on to task-based presence. Task-based presence is basically, I value you, I think of you in high regard only when you're being productive, focused, and on task, which is how many school systems are set up, unfortunately. And as little ones, if the parent is only there for the child with attention and presence if they're completing a task like homework, like working on a car or doing a sewing project, that is task-based presence, which is a marker or a factor that can play into avoidant dismissive attachment. Absence of touch. I touched a little bit on absence of touch, but absence of touch basically means we can have a lot of caring parents around, meaning caring, I make sure that you go to school on time, have your food, but there's no touch, there's no appropriate, compassionate physical touch and soothing for the child or the infant. And absence of touch can also be, as I explained in that previous example, of medical trauma or medical interventions. And there's a period of time where the baby or little one didn't get the touch, right, the physical soothing that they needed, because an infant can't be soothed with words without touch till a certain age. They need that skin-to-skin contact. Emotional neglect. Parents, have their own stuff going on, or emotionally unavailable, or they're non-responsive, misattuned, and overall the child isn't emotionally nourished. Emotional neglect, a very common one. Disruption in engagement or disruption in attachment. An example of this is many folks that I work with had to be the parent for their parents. If their parent had an undiagnosed mental health issue or full body issue, or even if it was diagnosed, for example, depression, there's a loss in family and the parent or the caregiver just can't get up from that grief. Postpartum depression, right, is a very common one, and if folks don't have the right support system around them, oftentimes a child needs to step up and be the parent and, cook the meals, take care of the parent's emotional needs. The parent is physically unable to engage with the child. If I'm depressed, I'm going to be locked in my room for a few days at a time, and little Johnny comes to the door and is like, "Mom, come play with me," and the parent is emotionally, physically unavailable. So this is another factor that can weave into avoidant dismissive. Lastly, rejection. When we are rejected by our primary caregivers, it really hurts. So we will do everything to protect ourselves, a self-protective response, to avoid avoidant attachment, to avoid being rejected. Another part that can play in here is even if the primary caregivers have a pretty solid, safe haven, if socially, due to our, the school, if there's bullying and things like that, rejection can happen, and we can show up as one kind of attachment style out in the world, and at home maybe we have a little bit of a different attachment style. And I'll talk to you more about that in the part 2. I call that the potpourri attachment style. Moving into anxious ambivalent attachment style, or attachment tendencies. This is the on again, off again attachment relationship. Some days the parent, the caregiver, was attentive and present when I reached out. They were there, loving, in connection. And other days they were unavailable, maybe dismissive, and just not able to connect. So this instills in the person a sense of stress, anxiousness, worry, and ultimately insecurity of, is it going to go left? Is it going to go right? The hallmarks are inconsistency and unpredictability. And what this looks like, what folks in adulthood are often labeled as, it doesn't make it right, but we're often labeled as clingy, overreactive, high-strung, too sensitive, needy, controlling, high maintenance. With anxious ambivalent, saying goodbye, departing from someone can be really stressful, whereas avoidant, dismissive, approaching can be stressful. So they're opposite in that sense. And ironically, especially in romantic relationships, we see this pairing a lot. At least I see it in my practice a lot, of one side of the partnership is more avoidant, dismissive, resonating, and the other side is more ambivalent, anxious. And it really gives us an opportunity to work and heal through things if both parties are willing. And at the same time, it can really be challenging because they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. How does this manifest as an adult? Well, we can be hyper-focused on relationships, hyper-focused on relationships at work, in our romantic life, and also in our friend group, always in other people's business, because it gives us a sense of security, like I won't be abandoned, I won't be left behind. Because the person with anxious, ambivalent tendencies tends to struggle with self-regulation. So I need someone else to help me regulate my physiological states, my stress, my emotions, and if I'm constantly in need of someone else to help me down-regulate my nervous system, then I can really waver on codependency. I can move towards I need rather than having a choice of being connected and co-regulating that's mutually beneficial. Someone with the anxious ambivalent style will feel like water in a desert when it comes to connection. Like, I need it. I'm so thirsty. So this sense of I need to look externally to help myself feel okay internally can lead to like a Tarzan effect when we're in relationships. This Tarzan effect is like swinging from tree to tree, swinging from relationship to relationship, because that's all we know. That all we know is I don't feel okay alone. If my attachment system is distant from me, I feel unsafe, and it's scary. It's hard for anxious ambivalent folks to be alone, which is the opposite generally for avoidant dismissive. We can have strong reactions to the misattunement of others. So if I'm sharing how I feel and someone responds in a way that in my head, I don't want them to respond like that, I can be angry, or I can have a volatile response, or just feel really sad or worried like I did something wrong. So the emotional nuances of others I'm very sensitive to, and I often project how I feel onto other people because I am so dependent on that external regulatory system of others. Work can suffer, career can suffer, because I'm so distracted by connecting with other people, whether I'm at work and instead of focusing on the task of getting the work done, it's more of a right brain over functioning of that emotional, intuitive connection part rather than the logical, linear side of the left brain. So, we can get distracted, we can get off task easily in a work environment where we're working on a team. And if we're focusing on a career, we can get into these relationships and stop putting effort and focus and driving our career path forward, because that romantic relationship is, again, like water in the desert. It's quenching our thirst, and it throws the balance of an individual off, and an individual can feel lost and like they're at the mercy of other people's choices, when really it's that underlying survival strategy and attachment system at play. Which leads me to my next point of giving, giving, and giving. Someone with this attachment style, they've learned as a child that, if I have a bid for connection, if I keep reaching out, giving, 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 it can be perceived as altruistic, but underneath that, the person is really overextending themselves. We can use the word self-abandoning in order to try and stabilize the relationship, to make sure things are okay and they don't get thrown off course. And this is very taxing on the autonomic nervous system and the rest of our system. So that's another factor that comes into play, is this overextending, this self-abandoning that can happen with the anxious ambivalent person, and we can get scattered and essentially lose our ground and lose our sense of ourself. Who am I really? What do I want? Even if it may be different than the people that I love and care about. So before we move on to how this develops in childhood, one last thing is long distance relationships can really be a burden on folks that identify more with the anxious ambivalent attachment style because of this object impermanence. As a child, we never knew if things would go left or right. It is unpredictable inconsistency. So long distance relationships can really be a burden because of that object impermanence. If I don't see the person that I care about, then it feels like they're not there. It feels like they don't care about me. Even if they do, and even if they're 100% in, it can feel at a cellular level like I've been abandoned again. So let's move on to childhood, the contributing factors of how anxious ambivalence attachment styles can develop. Inconsistency and unpredictability. Sometimes the child's needs were met with love, connection, affection, and other times the child's needs were not met and therefore created the sense of unworthiness or distress. So the foundations of ambivalent attachment is inconsistency and unpredictability. It's like we never know when the next shoe will drop, and in adulthood, even when things are going well, even when we are getting our needs met, we have this sense of things could switch at any moment and I could be abandoned because it's always flip-flopping. Unpredictability and inconsistency. The co-regulation just wasn't good enough. So, in a securely attached bond in childhood, the parent can ride through any emotion with the kid. If the kid is having a tantrum, which happens, the parent will be there, present. It's so uncomfortable, and that's part of being a parent and part of the hallmark of secure attachment is we can ride through any emotion. Like Dr. Daniel Siegel says with his window of tolerance, right? We can ride that sympathetic up and that wave and that parasympathetic down, and that's that regulation, that steady co-regulation. In anxious ambivalent, the child did not get that consistently. So maybe it was okay to be happy and joyful, or maybe a little bit stressed out, but when things kind of hit that edge of the parent's own capacity, the caregiver's own capacity, or maybe being sad or crying just wasn't allowed in the household, then that is that marker for that co-regulation wasn't good enough, because they would get the co-regulation sometimes, and then other times the child wouldn't get co-regulation. For example, generally it's for crying or emotions that are more intense. Another thing to do with regulation, as always, what the channel is all about, is interrupted regulation. So a child and a parent could be co-regulating really nicely, connecting, there can be love and affection and presence, and the next minute it's interrupted. It's either interrupted by the parent's inability to maintain that connection, or maybe it's, a call is more important. If that happens consistently, I gotta take this call, I gotta go, attend to a work thing, right? Or it can even be for interrupted regulation. If there's a lot of kids, if there's like 5 kids in the family, it's hard for the parent to be present and attuned to each one all the time. So, interrupted regulation can kind of instill this stress, because just when the kid's nervous system is coming down, it picks back up again. Just when it's coming down, it picks back up again. So it doesn't really go all the way to that nice, juicy ventral vagal parasympathetic baseline. Another really important one, all about the nervous system, of course, is overstimulation. Now, this can happen, and most often it happens when we're babies, is just because of we're unaware, or parents' misattunement, or being preoccupied. We miss these things. So baby will show the parent when they've had enough engagement, enough interaction. So if I'm holding, let's say, little baby Joseph, and I'm cooing away, oh, you're so beautiful, welcome to this world, right? And baby's looking up at me and cooing back, and then looks away. If I tell little baby Joseph, hey, look back at me, look back at mommy, then I am overstimulating his system, because naturally, especially as an infant, babies get stimulated very easily, and they need to look away. They need to disengage their eye contact so their little system can regulate and learn those nice little waves. But what we miss as humans, because no one teaches us these things until we know we can't do better, is we say, hey, look back at me, because mom, me, we can feel this sense of rejection if our kid doesn't want to engage with us all the time, and it creates this kind of like cat and mouse game later on in life of engaging. Someone leans in, the other person goes the other way, and that manifests later on in life. But the baseline of overstimulation can happen in those little nuances. The baby will put their hands up over their face, or look away, or just, if they're crawling, right, they can create distance between each other, space, and then their system will start to come down. Their breath will change, the flushness of their face will change as well. Little cues like that, their heart rate will go down. And we do this at any age, or we ought to do this at any age. If we are at a meeting at work, and maybe it's like 2 or 3 hours long, it's important to take those pee breaks, even if you don't have to go pee. Just go move your body, walk around, notice your breath, and that's self-regulation. It's important that we do that when we're on Zoom calls, when we're engaging eye to eye, face to face. It's okay to take a break, look at the trees, take a sip of your tea, notice your feet on the ground. That helps us, especially if we resonate with this anxious avoidant, helps our nervous system down regulate. And like I started out by saying, this anxious ambivalent will rely more on others. This is a way that we can start relying more on ourselves and building that organic self-regulation that we can all create for ourselves. And by the way, if you want to learn more about that, watch the video, How Do I Create Secure Attachment for Yourself? And there's also lots of other videos on the channel that you can learn about that as well. What does the anxious ambivalent person need? We need reassurance, reliability, and consistency, because this is the exact opposite ingredients that we got in childhood. And another thing on top of this is this concept of self-abandoning. self-abandoning in order to stabilize a relationship. Take note of where you may be doing that in your own life. And lastly, learning how to self-regulate. So make sure you check out the other videos on my channel, because self-regulation and truly mutual beneficial co-regulation is really a game changer for the folks that I work with that have or resonate with this ambivalent attachment style. So the bottom line is that our attachment system is broad and alive and well in all humans. It's just that if we had to adapt early on in life or throughout our life, we may have one of these insecure attachment styles. And even if we have an avoidant attachment style and it appears that we don't want relationship, it's just that we don't have that sense of safety in connection with others. So this is really about building an internal safety map, an internal sense of safety, rewriting it, and changing the way we relate and the way we live. So make sure you watch part 2 of this video, the disorganized and secure attachment, and check out that attachment education playlist over on my channel. Thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in the next video. Take good care.